Good morning to you, Jenny. This is a space that I feel like we haven't gone more than a week or two without talking about because it's just been so much in the spotlight as a result of everything that's been going on in regards to shutdowns, change of kind of activities, and companies not sending employees across the country as much for meetings. A lot more things happening virtually, and obviously one of the areas impacted has been travel.
Travel, yes. And these are names, it seems like the airlines kind of consistently have traded in tandem. So to go through some of these numbers I thought were interesting. American is down 50% this year, but they are up 25% this month. And Delta's down 52% this year, but they are up nearly 12% this month. United is down 59% this year, but they are up 15% this month. And the same theme is kind of following suit with fourth course Southwest, Spirit, Alaskan Air, JetBlue. All of them are trading kind of this way where they're up this month and they're up, of course, today. And this could be due in part to data from the U.S. Transportation Security Administration, which showed that travelers going through TSA pre-checkpoints rose to 831,000 Sunday. And this was up from about 800,000 in the week prior. So this is the most we've seen air travel since March 17th, so about a 5-month high. Now, this is obviously great news. However, when you look at the year-over-year picture, it gets a little bit more grim. We saw the total was still down about 70% from the year prior if you look at year-over-year numbers, but this is still somewhat of an improvement because at the worst level, we saw only 87,000 travelers going through TSA checkpoints on April 14th, which was down about 97% for the year. So slowly but surely, people are starting to travel again. However, it's also important to know about the payroll support extension program, the likeliness of this. It seems like airlines are kind of in this holding period, waiting to see if they're going to get an extension for government funding. So right now, everyone's kind of in this holding period. However, this topic is actually very near and dear to my heart because I was on an airplane yesterday. I traveled into O'Hare Airport, and it was as busy as it's ever been. I mean, you would have never really known that there was any different. Now, compare this to the week prior when I flew out. I actually tweeted about how there was no one in the airport. So I said airline demand in a nutshell, the most empty I've ever seen these screens. So within 1 week of each other, I went from seeing an empty O'Hare to a completely full O'Hare. So that just goes to show the way, right now things are changing so quickly. It just depended if I was there on a Friday versus a Sunday. It seemed like I was in a completely different airport in a completely different time, which was kind of interesting. But our next tweet is from Charlie, who says, bottom performing stocks in the S&P 500 this year. And he lists Norwegian Cruise Line is down 76%, Carnival is down 72%, Cody is down 64%, United Airlines is down 61%, and Royal Caribbean is down 60%. And then there's just few more oil companies at the bottom, but more significantly, all of these tourism companies, we talk about, airlines, we talk about cruise lines, we talk about hotels, they have seen such volatility because it seems like there are so many unknowns in this space. Sean, how do you go about trading with these names? Because there just is so many uncertainties still to come for the short and long term.
Yeah, so one thing that we just talked about this when we were looking at Citigroup as the bank, and that is you almost need to take what we saw in April and May, that price action, and kind of set it off to the side because that was when we weren't sure if the airlines were going to go bankrupt. They were going to start defaulting on their loans, what sort of demand there would be, when we would even see that demand coming back. So a lot of that uncertainty has sort of been pulled off the table, which can be supportive now where you can start to go out there and look at some price levels. So in United Airlines, you could maybe look at that $30 price level and say, look, as long as we don't go into the assumption or the risk that these airlines are going to go bankrupt and we're never going to get people back out there flying again, maybe we can look at that $30 price level as a support. But then we can also say at the same time, we're getting more demand back, which is a good sign, but maybe we're not going to get the full on return to normalcy until we get a vaccine out there. And so maybe that might act as a little bit of something that could keep some resistance levels in place on the upside. And so then you can go back and say, well, where were they at before? It kind of looked like they immediately repriced lower below that 40 level. So you start to get an idea of price levels based off of what's going on, and that is until we maybe get full normalcy back, everything's reopened, probably, not going to see us trading too far north of 40, but also we're probably not going to see them, going belly up, because the government has shown that they're willing to step out there and extend loans to make sure they're at least viable companies. So maybe we can start looking at that 30 level of support. And once you start doing things like that, then you're sort of identifying a range, and you can look at some sort of trading strategies that match range-bound trading, or trading around a certain price level. And then one other thing you look at here, when I look at the volume level, I always like looking at volume at price. That 35 level, which is sort of right in between 40 and 30, is where the volume spikes at. So that's where the bulk of the volume is going on, as well as that 35 level, which can sort of keep the stock chopping around there. So you start to get some interesting setups for range type trading, or strategies that involve the stocks being near a given price level moving forward, at least for the near term.
Yeah, and Sean, I know one of these studies you use is the volume profile, and that's what you're referring to. And of course, you're talking United Airlines, which will ultimately be what we look at in example trade later on at the end of the show. But Jenny, we got to leave it there. Great stuff as always, an interesting, personal experience as you talk about kind of the differences between the airlines, or the airports rather, at different points in time. So we'll see, and hopefully that trend continues as we see those airports start to fill back up. But to help us get a little bit more of an insight into what's going on in this space, we got Andy Swan joining us now as we say goodbye to Jenny Horn. Andy, co-founder of LikeFolio.com. We'd love to get your take on this. We've had this conversation a handful of times now in regards to kind of the comparison across these different airlines. And I know from our last conversation, Andy, the big winner so far has been Southwest as a result of some of its more favorable, cancellation and flexibility in terms of policies. And some of these other ones have been, losers, but there's been a kind of a shuffling of the guard, if you will, within those other three. And I don't know, how you project things going forward, or how much is going to impact things in the near term.
Well, things have changed since the last time I was on, which is mostly positive for all of the names. When we look at this, what we're looking at is airline sentiment comparison. This is the 30-day moving average of LikeFolio's information around when people talk about these brands, when they talk about flying with these companies or booking flights. Is it a positive note or is it a negative note? And what we're tracking on this is a 0 to 100 scale. You can see most of the airlines fit inside of the 35 to 65% happiness. A lot of people like to complain about their airline travels, but comparing them against each other can be very instructive. And so you can see that since these quarantines and a lot of these major changes to air travel, really Delta has been the big loser, because it used to be one of the most liked airlines that people enjoyed flying and doing business with the most, right up there with Southwest, but it's fallen dramatically. But in the last 2 or 3 months, we've started to see an uptick in all of the airlines except for American, who just continues to languish down at the bottom. And so what this tells me, I really want to watch Delta moving forward as planes start to air travel starts to open back up, as airports start to open back up. Does Delta resume its satisfaction of customers or not? Because right now Southwest is the runaway leader. In fact, United has even surged ahead of Delta. A lot of that, though, is I got to put a little asterisk on United, because United's also the one out of our data that has the biggest drop off in number of people flying with it. And so they may be benefiting from the fact that less customers are actually experiencing their service level and getting a little bit of a boost out of that. So I think Delta's the one to watch. We want to watch this consumer sentiment and happiness level. If it stays depressed, I think Delta's going to have a tough time competing at the level that they were and charging the prices that they were when things do resume.
And Andy, real quick here. So I look at that, and you kind of answered this a little bit by pointing out some of the discrepancies that we see in the data in terms of United and Delta, kind of that shuffling. Because I look at that and I see Delta is well off the levels that it was for the reasons that you've talked about, several times in the show, primarily due to kind of cancellations and things like that, and them being a little bit less flexible than, let's say, Southwest. But in regards to United kind of recovering fully, obviously it's an extremely important note and an asterisk that if they don't have as many people flying, that's ultimately going to be a concern, especially if they're not coming back at the same rate as the other airlines. But let's say that it is a reflective population, and that is, if they do get back to more normal levels, that they have now taken the second spot. Jenny just pointed out this is the worst performing airline. So in terms of stock price performing, it seems to be the worst in terms of year-to-date performance, yet it's the one that seems to have gained the most, possibly, in regards to maybe second to Southwest, in regards to kind of where it lines up on sentiment, which we know is more of a long-term indicator. So I guess, Andy, my question is, does this line up that if United kind of figures out kind of the cost side of things, they could come out a winner in this space?
Yeah, I think that's possible. And I think, to put a more of a precise note on it, I think the Delta could come out the loser. And that's probably the bigger story here because, if we think about Delta, it was able to charge more money for a much better level of service and perceived consumer sentiment. And that translated through in LikeFolio's consumer happiness and across all types of industry surveys. If they are not able to satisfy consumers at the level that they were prior to the pandemic, and new policies make it impossible for them to do things as well as they were, or they're just unwilling to due to budget constraints. That really changes the value proposition for the consumer. It makes a United very competitive with Delta going forward. And like you said, this is a long-term look. So we're early on in the comeback. Like Jenny said, we're still off 65, 70% on TSA check-ins. All of our data is supportive of that. So it's very reflective. And so it's a very early look, but it's one we want to really keep an eye on because sentiment, generally speaking, is a very good long-term driver. Big shifts in sentiment are very predictive long-term of consumer behavior shifts. And it could be setting up that Delta is seeing consumers shift away from their brand through this process.
So, Andy, we're almost out of time here. Just a real quick question for you, real quick answer if we could. As you kind of point out all of these kind of, the added values that these kind of different airlines can provide in terms of service, maybe being, kind of dampened and a little bit tougher to deal with as a result of everything going on, makes it harder to really, make that proposition, harder to increase prices. Is there a potential for companies like Spirit and more of the budget airlines, the ones that are seen below these, to come out as the winner as it just becomes a price-sensitive market?
Yeah, I think, eventually you're sitting in a seat wearing a mask, not talking to anybody and not getting any refreshments no matter where you go. You might as well go with the low price leader. I think that's what's hurting Delta, absolutely.
Cool. Well, all right, Andy, we'll see what happens. It's a long-term story. I'm sure we'll come back to this several times over the next few months, and we'll see how things are shaping up. Always a pleasure. Andy Swan, co-founder of LikeFolio.com.